Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Anek Dhara's fifth webinar. I'm Ravi Babu. Basically, we'll start with a brief introduction of Anek Dhara. Anek Dhara is a public policy portal started by a small set of retired civil servants. Our aim in setting up Anek Dhara is to deviate from the unhappy state of social discourse emanating from the unverified, divisive, and sectarian narratives emerging on TV and social media. Our effort, however small it is to replace with an informed and nuanced discussion on complex issues that face the nation in the current context. Hallmark of our webinars being the presence of well-read and informed speakers, allotment of sufficient time to the speakers to express their views without distraction, and free flow of questions and answers in the discussions without an aggressive stance. In keeping these objectives, we have been hosting webinars on the last Sunday of every month, and this is the fifth in the series. The first four webinars, out of the first four webinars, three were on the leading figures in the history of modern India, Nehru, Gandhi, and Ambedkar. Fourth one was on the idea of India. At Anek Dhara, we welcome continuous feedback and inputs, and the chat box and also the description given in the video gives us our website address, Facebook and Telegram links for continuous updates, and email ID for suggestions and feedback. With this short introduction, we will go to today's webinar. History of Indian, title of being History of Indian History Writing. So essentially, history of writing of Indian history is exciting and relevant, especially in the current context of calls for rewriting history emanating from various sources. So how does history get written and how has it evolved in the current context is what the focus of the discussion will be. And Professor E.H. Carr, in his famous book, What is History, quotes the following. The historian and facts of history are necessary to one another. The historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without their historian are dead and meaningless. My first answer, therefore, to question what is history is that it is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and the facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. So it is in this context that every generation looks at history in its own light, in the context of various facts and various thought processes that are going on. So our historians, the contemporary historians in that context have classified three distinct trends in history writing out of a large number of trends that have emerged. The first is with reference to the colonial writers and their perceptions of Indian history, where their interaction with Indian society and how they perceived from the Western conception or the British conception. Then, in response to this, there was emergence of distinct national historians who either participated in the national movement or were sympathetic to it. So they questioned the colonial writing. However, both these periods were characterized by a distinct three major periods of history. That is the Hindu, Muslim, and the British. So, and this has also become one of the prominent hallmarks, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, of various religious sections or various groups looking history in its own perception, especially in the communal divide that has emanated both from Muslim and Hindu nationalist histories. So, and the later trend, especially starting with Professor D.D. Kosambi, will focus more on the social aspects of changes that are brought into the history. So, in this context, again, we may remember, I quote Professor Ramila Thapa, as a historian, I am aware that I too am the part of the historical process and that the paradigm will shift in the future. The direction of the shift may be drawn on the way history is viewed in the present times, unquote. So this is the exciting part of what is history. Now, I conclude this introduction with a small poem written by a great Telugu poet, Sri Sri, History of the Nations. So he says, he defines what is not the essence of the history in two stanzas, which I quote again. What was the war's cause? How long was this regime's course? Dates and documents deduce, not the history's essence. The stories of these queens' romances, the expenses incurred from that invasion, meanings and explanations, these are not the essence of history. Then he goes on to explain what is the essence of history, where, and I quote again, trapped deep underneath, seized in the darker annals beneath, stories we lost sight to unearth, no more than can be concealed the truth. What a common man Nile civilization, which coolly laid the stone for Taj Mahal's construction. In the saga of an empire's victory, what was the share of a soldier's bravery? It is not the Lord's palanquin that matters, but who are its pallbearers. He finally concludes exploitation of one by other, enslaving a race by another, servitude as a social evil, no more on this soil. With this bright hope, I hope this our Anek Dhara webinars will help in setting up a just and a humane society to the little extent that we can actually do. So with this introduction, I'll go into the webinar format. We have two eminent speakers who will be addressing us, Professor Salil Misra and Professor S B Upadhyay, each taking around 25 minutes. This will be followed by a discussion for around 30 minutes, and participants logging into the YouTube are requested to post the questions on the chat box. All questions will be categorized and clubbed, and the speakers will be requested to respond to them. Either of them will respond or both will address these questions. With this, now I go on to introduce Professor Salil Misra to start the webinar. We at Anek Dhara are privileged to have Professor Salil Misra as the first speaker on the topic. He acquired his master's degree in modern Indian history from the Center for Social Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, from where he went on to do a PhD under communal politics in UP in 1937 to 39 under the supervision of the legendary Professor Bipen Chandra. His publications include a monograph on a narrative of communal politics in Uttar Pradesh and a small booklet in Hindi on Swaraj Party brought out by the National Book Trust. The booklet is part of NBT's mission to popularize the Indian national movement among the rural audiences through a series of small booklets written in Indian languages. He has also published articles on themes related to communal politics, language questions, Hindi and Urdu, partition of India, social science teaching, and identity politics. He has been invited by UP History Congress, Punjab History Congress, and the Andhra Pradesh History Congress as sectional president for their sessions. He was the general president of the UP History Congress for the year 2019. He has been nominated as the president of Modern Indian section of the forthcoming Indian History Congress. Professor Salil Misra taught history at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi from 1984 till 1987, and during 1998 to 2010, he was the faculty of the Indira Gandhi National Open University. Professor Misra was involved in the collection of documents for research project towards freedom for the year 1942, sponsored by Indian Council of Historical Research. As a member of the editorial team, along with Professor Bipin Chandra, Dr. Vishalakshi Menon, the volume was recently published during April-July 2019. He was a visiting researcher at the Center for History of Emotions, Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Berlin. Currently, he is the professor of history at the Ambedkar University, Delhi. Over to you, sir, Professor Salil Misra. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ravi Babu, for those kind words. And I'm also very thankful to Anek Dhara for this very important venture, and personally for giving me this opportunity to share some of my ideas on this very important theme, the idea of civilization in history writings and its relevance today. I want to use this opportunity provided by Anek Dhara, and I want to make 3 points. I want to do 3 things today in my talk. One, I want to talk about the idea of civilization as it developed in writings, history writing, but writings in general. Secondly, I want to talk about the changes that came about in this understanding, or rather how the concept of civilization grew and evolved in different writings. And thirdly, I want to talk about how we need to constantly update and revise our imagination of what is a civilization, particularly with reference to alternative ways of looking at human societies and human collectivities. So, and I will take at about 25 minutes now. Friends, the idea of civilization is both old and new at the same time. It is old because whenever we refer to a civilization, we actually refer to a pre-modern formation. You know, Indus Valley civilization, Egyptian, Islamic, these are all pre-modern formations. We generally use the word civilization along with empire, yet another pre-modern idea. By and large, we use it in that context. Recently, in 1996, when Samuel Huntington used it in the contemporary context, in the context of modern world, in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, in 1996, I think, it created quite a controversy because people were not used to having this word civilization being used in a contemporary context. Friends, when we look back, when we generally look back at the distant past, historians and scholars, and when we find societies with literary or aesthetic achievements, societies which had access to written word, which were large in size, which had some degree of centralization, we tend to designate them as civilizations. There can, of course, be different sources of the connectivity or civilization or centralization. It could be through religion, it could be through dynastic continuity, it could be through political control, or some other, even technology. Technology could be a source of creating this connectivity. So all these are then building blocks in our understanding of civilization, or rather, they are the furniture of what we call the civilization. Um, it is almost like our imagination of a middle class drawing room today. We know that some feature is an essential part of that drawing room, isn't it? And when we find the presence of some such furniture, and by furniture here I mean written word, literary accomplishments, religion, technology, dynastic continuity, political centralization, when we find all these things or some of these things in some society or in some territory of the past, we generally designate that society or that human collectivity as a civilization. So in that sense, the idea of civilization is an old idea. However, the idea of civilization is also very new and modern. It is new and modern because this way of looking at the past, looking at the societies of the past, is very modern. This idea was born and constructed in 18th century Europe. The word civilization was derived from civility, and it was used to refer to a high culture. There was clearly, in European understanding, there was clearly a hierarchy of civilizations, of societies. It was a new hierarchy, and it was linked to the ideas of the Enlightenment and later to the ideas of Darwinism, particularly the idea of evolution. You know, the idea in which the evolved or latter forms are both higher and superior to the previous earlier forms. So in that sense, there is this evolution which fed into the general understanding, imagination of civilization. In Hindi, in our languages, the word used for civilization is sabhyata. It is obviously Sanskrit. It is obviously used to refer to a higher form of culture. In Persian and later in Urdu, it was tahzeeb and tamaddun, all of them referring to a high and a superior culture. Sometimes we also use, it was also used in the sense of city versus urban. So city versus village. So urban formations were designated as civilizations. The idea of civilization also had its other. There were some people, some groups that were outside the pale. Savages, barbarians, primitive, they were considered outside the pale of civilization. And later, tribals also, new way of looking at the older societies, isolated groups without written word. They were also outside the pale of civilization. In India, the words that were used were Mlech, Adivasi, Vanvasi, Janajati. Uh, Again, these were groups that were not equipped with the furniture that I talked about, written word, written literature, and so on. Coming now to India, after this elementary understanding of civilization, it was said, and it has now been said, that India was an old civilization, but Indians acquired a civilizational consciousness only in the 19th century. Now, this acquiring of civilizational consciousness happened primarily through Western or European, or more specifically, British knowledge on India's past. There were primarily two strands of this British knowledge or European knowledge about India's past. The first strand developed since the end of the 18th century and is generally associated with names like William Jones. You have heard of Orientalists. You have also heard of Max Muller, who joined this group later. Orientalists, they were great admirers of Indian past, of Indian civilization. They considered Indian civilization, Indian past, to be superior to European past. They found golden ages in India's past. So this way of looking at particular period as a golden age in our history writing, this goes back to the contribution of Orientalists. They also extolled the great literary accomplishments and the achievements of Indian society, Indian literature, etc. Now, their understanding was derived primarily from Sanskrit sources. So their imagination of Indian civilization was primarily Sanskrit-based. William Jones also discovered a common ancestry of Europeans and the Indians. When he was a great scholar of classical languages, when he started learning, he already knew Greek and Latin. When he started learning Sanskrit, he found a great similarity between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin of subsistence terminology, cities for names for relationships, mother, father. And from here, became dominant the story of a common origin. Also, it was from here that linguistics as an academic discipline, language as a way of understanding the society, that started. Max Muller, much later in the 19th century, wrote an important book, What Can We Learn from India, or What Can India Teach Us? The great binary between materialistic West and spiritualistic East, East being pursued in being involved in non-material pursuits as against the West. This binary also developed around the same period and was developed by the Orientalists. So this was one kind of an input of ideas on Indian civilization that came from England. The second strand was completely in opposition to the first one. And the second strand also became very popular in England. This came from James Mill, or from utilitarians. Now, he said things which were just the opposite of what William Jones had said. He was very critical of William Jones. They considered, James Mill and people of that school of thought, they considered Indian civilization as backward, as barbaric, and very low in the scale of civilization. There was a scale of civilization, and Indians stood very, very low. Now, James Mill's ideas were very influential with the British civil services. They also played an important role in the policy formulation. Mill also wrote a book, History of British India, in which he divided the Indian history into three periods: Hindu, Muslim, and British. And I think Mr. Raja Babu referred to it in his introduction. His periodization, this Hindu, Muslim, and British, that also remained very dominant and powerful for a very, very long time. His ideas also influenced Macaulay, a law minister in the East India Company, great follower of Mill. He also had a very disparaging view of Indian civilization. He said, I do not have the exact quote, but he said, all the knowledge produced in the East will fill one column of some European or some British library. So there is not very much in the Eastern knowledge, or there's not too much of knowledge in the Indian civilization. They don't have a sense of history. Now, these two, the Orientalist idea of deep admiration and the utilitarian idea of looking down in disparaging terms, these two ideas became very dominant ideas on Indian civilization till the mid-19th century. They were in complete contradiction with each other. But what were the Indians doing? I think the Indians were probably listening to these ideas and keeping quiet. Then they started talking back. And I'm using the word talking back is the title of a very important book by Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. Much of my talk is actually based on that book. It says the discourse of civilization in India. I forget the exact title, but it's on the history of the idea of a civilization. Talking back is the important point in that book. Indians started talking back since the second half of the 19th century. Now, this initiative in talking back by Indians against these British ideas, both Orientalist and utilitarian. The initiative in this talking back was taken by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee from Bengal and R.G. Bhandarkar from Maharashtra. These two created new beginnings in thought. They were also a kind of a bridge between the traditional knowledge and modern knowledge. They tried to connect India's past, present with India's past, and India with Europe. So they tried to place India's past of the present of the 19th century in terms of time with India's past and in terms of space with Europe and other parts of the world. Bankim argued that there is a rivalry, there should be a rivalry between India and England. This rivalry is good. Jatiya Bair was the word that he used. And Indians should not simply imitate the British. Indians should rival the British. This rivalry would be good. He argued that we were superior, we, the Indians, were superior in the past, but Europeans are superior now. They are superior in science, in technology, and in modern knowledge. We, the Indians, we lagged behind because we did not have national unity. Europeans had national unity. In Europe, state systems had played an important role in creating the basis for this national unity. And I think this was the reason why Bankim admired leaders, heroes such as Shivaji, Rana Pratap, and Ranjit Singh. Because in Bankim's opinion, these people were trying to create unity through state effort. And that was important. So he saw that as a model for India. Bankim linked the question of civilization with that of state and also Indian nationalism. The question was, how should the old and traditional civilization transform into a modern national society, modern Indian nation? How should this happen? Bankim is very important because he advanced this idea of civilization in very, very new directions. It was very different from how Indians were looking at Indian society and Indian history, but also from how some of the British thinkers looked upon it. So he created an important break. But there were many questions to which Bankim did not really have the answer. His narrative, his imagination obviously left some very important questions for us or for people of that generation. One important question was that Indian civilization was different and unique in some ways, but it was different from the European civilizations, European societies. But when this civilization will transform into an Indian nation, which was necessary it was which was a modern requirement, then would Indian civilization not become very similar to Great Britain and lose its distinctiveness? So how to become a nation, how to become a national society by retaining the distinctiveness of the past and of traditions? How to do it? This was the important question. The second important question, which was unresolved in Bankim, was that religion was a very important element in the Indian civilization. It provided the basis for unity. But there was not, religion does not simply unite, it also divides, particularly in a society like India, which is multi-religious, where there are many religions. So how to handle this question? Vivekananda had put it very well in his own way. Vivekananda said that politics was to Europe, was religion was to India. Politics was the basis of unity in European societies, but religion would be the basis for unity in India. But in what way? How? Because religion, obviously, which religion? These were the unresolved questions. And these and some more were unresolved dilemmas on the question of civilization. Now, these questions were taken up and addressed in a very creative and a very important way by leaders like Tagore and Gandhi, and later even Nehru in his discovery of India. So I'm creating a chain of ideas from Bankim Bhandarkar to Tagore to Gandhi to Jawaharlal Nehru in this sequence on the idea of the civilization and how changes subsequently came about. Gandhi, in his book Hind Swaraj, which was written in 1909, he completely rejected the idea that Indian nation should resemble the British nation in any way. He argued that Indian nation has to be based on Indian tradition, Indian past. And that would be, therefore, Indian past was different, so Indian nation would also be different. And this was probably the reason why Gandhi placed so much of emphasis on tradition. He was not so much of a traditionalist, but it was one way of maintaining the distinctively Indian identity in Indian nation, which would otherwise resemble all the other nations, would resemble the British nation. But if it was based on Indian past, Indian traditions, then it would retain its uniqueness and its distinctivity. So India had to retain its uniqueness through its own past, which is why tradition was important. But it was on the religious question that Tagore and later Gandhi provided the most profound and creative answer. Tagore was perhaps the first, in fact, he was the first to come up with the idea of syncretic civilization, or a civilization based on religious syncretism, in which religion itself was syncretic. There was a common thread, there were connecting links, there were shared ground between all Indian religions. All Indian religions had something in common. And therefore, the idea of syncretism was put forward. It was probably Tagore's way of answering a question which had been left unaddressed by Bankim. The idea of syncretism subsequently became very, very important and a very big building block in the civilizational discourse. Gandhi articulated it further. In a very interesting, innovative way, Gandhi used the word religion in two ways, with capital R and with small r. When he used the word with capital R, he used it in terms of a system of faith, morality, commonality. And when he used it in small r, then he used it denominationally, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Sikhism. So he would make statements which were only superficially contradictory, but they were completely logically consistent. Gandhi would write, religion is one, and he would write this with capital R. And then he would say, religions are many, and this was with a small r. He would also use the word root religion and branches. There is one root from which there are different branches. So Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, they are branches of the same root. It was in this way that this problem of one or many was addressed and resolved by our leaders. Tagore added yet another very important element in this understanding, in this capital of ideas, heritage of ideas. Tagore argued that in Europe, state systems have been the major agents in the spread of civilization. Therefore, they are expansionist, they are aggressive, they are aggrandizing. Bunkim was also facing this problem that nation states, particularly in European nation states, they are expansionist. See what they have done in Latin America and other countries. Our nation should not be like this. Ideal nation should not be expansionist. But Tagore answered the question, and Tagore said that in India, state has not been the major agent in the creation of unity. The unity of formations, groups has been created by socio-religious movements, Bhakti movement, Sufi movement, Sikhism. They have played an important role in the spread of civilizations. And therefore, that neutralizes the threat, the possibility of expansionism. Expansionism happens when state is the major agent in the spread of civilization. Thus, it was in this way that a very new civilizational discourse was developing. It was not fixed at any point in time, but it was dynamic and it was growing. This discourse was obviously it was a way to counter the hegemonic ideas that were coming from the West, Europeans. There was a kind of a talking back by Indian leaders in this idea of the civilization. There was also a very new thinking that was developing on the relationship between religion and civilization, between role of various socio-religious movements in history. And I think these ideas from Tagore, from Bankim to Tagore to Gandhi, Vivekanand, they were also creating the ideational basis of national unity at that point in time. Now, these discourses developed as a long chain of thought, starting from Bankim and then through Tagore and Gandhi, and they were developed further by Nehru, particularly in his book, Discovery of India, particularly his idea of unity in diversity. Today, it has become so commonsensical that its profundity does not get noticed or this idea gets taken for granted. But I think it was a very important and a very, very profound idea. The fact that it has become very common and very popular now should not take away anything from its original merit and from its original profundity. These are very profound ideas. But these ideas on civilization were generated in a particular context by our leaders. When professional and academic writings started in the 20th century, now these academic writings, history writings, social science writings, made very good use of this framework that was created by our leaders, our intellectual and political leaders. So in the 20th century, G.S. Ghure, the sociologist, N.K. Bose, the anthropologist, Ashish Nandi, the psychologist and political philosopher, Yogendra Singh, the sociologist, Romila Thapar, the historian of ancient India, and Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, on whose ideas, on whose book my lecture today is based. They have all enriched, critiqued the discourse, they have enriched it, they have also critiqued it, and they have also expanded its philosophical horizons. My last point is, friends, today, as we stand, wherever we do, we need to grapple with some important questions and dilemmas on this idea of civilization. So just like Bankim had given us an insight, but he also left some questions which were addressed subsequently. Our major writings have also resolved many questions, but they have also created new questions which need to be addressed and resolved. What are these questions? The need and the importance of a national unity is clear and self-evident. There is no doubt about it. The past and traditions must play some role, and an important role in it is also very, very clear. But the idea of civilization will play a role. But the idea of civilization is both exclusive and hierarchical. Sometimes it excludes South, emerges as seems like a very North Indian civilization. And K.M. Panikkar had pointed out, said the imagination of civilization is very North India centric. Sometimes it is constructed in a very Hindu way, in such a way that it seems like a Hindu civilization. It includes the input. Sometimes it is constructed largely on the basis of Sanskrit texts and thereby excluding other religious traditions. Buddhism often gets left out. We don't talk about a Buddhist civilization, even though there was a time when through South Asia and Southeast Asia, there was a great spread of this. But because it did not develop into any significant separate nation state, then I think the Buddhist civilization does not get talked about very much, even though it possessed all the ingredients. This was not just our idea of civilization was not just exclusive. The idea is also very, very hierarchical. Many non-literary cultures or many groups which did not have access to written word, written records, tribes, low caste communities, they often get in this imagination of Indian civilization, they often get located at the margins. All civilizations have a cultural core or a cultural mainstream. And in the making of this core, often the contributions of these groups, these people, these cultures, these communities, they get neglected. These are obviously some of the pitfalls in the civilizational discourse. Should we then give up the paradigm of civilization and talk simply of cultures? Or should we reimagine the idea of civilization in new ways, keeping these pitfalls in mind? These are the challenges that need to be taken up and addressed by scholars and thinkers of our generation and of the next generation. But it's a very rich and a vibrant tradition that I wanted to speak to you about. Thank you very much. I think I've completed my 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Misra. It's a wonderful exposition on both conceptually defining civilization at various points of time, both with Western thought and Indian thought, and the response of Indian thinkers to the Western thoughts on Indian civilization. Of course, Professor Misra has also highlighted some of the features which we have not included them. Various caste groups, various tribal groups, and various past religious groups like Buddhists and all those thoughts. So he has posed, Professor Misra has explained some factors and also posed a lot of interesting challenges. So these will be taken up at the question hour time. Next speaker is Professor S B Upadhyay. He will be speaking on colonialism and the writing of Indian history. Now I request Gagarin to introduce Professor S B Upadhyay. Then Professor S B Upadhyay will continue. Thank you.
Good morning, all the participants as well as our esteemed speakers. Satyameva jayate non-rutam. Satyena pandha vitato devayanaha. Yenakramanti rishayo hyapta kama yatra tat satyasya paramam nidhanam. Truth alone triumphs, not falsehood. Through truth, the divine path is spread out, by which the sages whose desires have been completely fulfilled reach to where is that supreme treasure of truth. I don't know, only such sagely historians explore history disinterestedly for truth to triumph. It is a very debated question, but in any way, it is too good to be true, as the African proverb bemoans, until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. Whether this truism pertains to colonialism or not, the question is colonial a Western invention? No, at least we feel it is not and it cannot be. The 2500-year Indian history after the Rig Veda and before the British began their divine despoliation of India, isn't it colonial? Wasn't. In fact, still 20% of the Indian population ghettoized. The colonial masters must have put placards. Indians and dogs are not allowed into European clubs. But had even the worst laws of segregation had rules such as I quote from Gautama, Dharma Sutra. Now, if a Shudra listens intentionally to a recitation of the Veda, his ears shall be filled with molten tin or lac. If he recites Vedic texts, his tongue shall be cut out. If he remembers them, his body shall be split in twain. If he assumes a position equal to that of the twice-born men, in sitting, in lying down, in conversation or road, he shall undergo corporal punishment. There may be 2 million pages written about British colonial exploitation of India from Dadabhai Nauroji to Shashi Tharoor. How many pages are written about the Hindu upper classes led by the priestly class exploiting the Hindu Shudras in general and 20% Indians called untouchables in particular for more than 2000 years? Hasn't the time come to juxtapose 200-year external colonial exploitation with Hindus exploiting and dehumanizing their Shudra and untouchable brethren and co-religionists? Professor Sashibhushan Upadhyay's profile prod this thought in me reflexively. Whatever he deals now, maybe mostly 200 years, in future, certainly he and many of the historians, including Professor Salil Misra ji, must give a thought to this, we thought, basically because can a Hindu brother brutalizing another Hindu brother make it less unjust than the white colonizers' cruelty? In fact, the indigenous brutality is more unimaginably unjust and inexpressibly horrendous as the perpetrator and the victim are compatriots and co-religionists. Therefore, it is its unabashed continuation and its indigenous historical colonial roots must be studied more deeply, broadly, and widely. If not, our study of colonial historiography will at best be partial and at worst conspiratorial, as revealed by the many reports like the Oxfam Inequality Report 2021, the study published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the United States, etc. They found that Adivasis, Dalits have significantly, almost to the extent of 15 years, less life expectancy than upper caste Hindus. So that is why Dr. Sashibhushan's profile has prodded me this. Dr. Sashibhushan Upadhyay is a professor of history in the Indira Gandhi National Open University. He did his undergraduation from the Allahabad University and MA and PhD in JNU. For about 30 years now, he has been a teacher in the IGNOU. His research interests are mainly in the fields of historiography, labor history, Dalit studies, and literary studies. His publications include books titled Historiography in the Modern World, published in 2016, and Existence, Identity, and Mobilization, the Cotton Mill Workers of Bombay, covering the period of 1890-1919, published in 2004. And two co-edited volumes, Dalit Assertion in Society, Literature and History, published in 2010, and School Education, Pluralism and Marginality, published in 2012, and about 25 articles on various themes relating to labor, work, Premchand, Dalit literature, historiography, and nationalism. Besides, he also wrote about 30 units for the course material prepared in IGNOU for the students. These units are on various themes such as history writing, Indian national movement, labor movement, and tourism studies. A very nice, wonderful thing. That is the reason why I have got this reflexive idea. Thanks a lot, Professor Upadhyay ji, for accepting our invitation. Now to you, sir, Professor Upadhyay.
Thank you, Shri Gagarin. And of course, I have been working on various themes over a period of time. It would be interesting if I go through some of them at some point. But at the moment, my focus will be entirely on how colonialism changed the course of our history writing. And it's on that only I'm going to speak. Of course, many other themes which you have discussed might come up in the process, but it will be only through how colonialism shaped our history writing. Colonialism, as you know, is also an ancient idea. Imperialism and colonialism, civilization. But there has been a difference, again, like civilization, because all the pre-modern colonial or imperial ideas were mostly projects, we can say imperial or colonial projects were based mostly on political and economic imperatives. Mostly, not all, but mostly, primarily. It was political in the sense that most of the emperors would be happy if the subordinates would recognize their sovereignty and pay their token tributes. Economic also, when some empires expanded to a larger area, so they derived some taxes, but only from a limited area. Other areas were tributary only. So economic imperatives were less than the political. It was mostly political, that they wanted to be recognized as emperors so that they can have their ego satisfied. The modern imperialist and colonial project is completely different. It was completely different. It was political, of course, but more than political, it was economic, and more than economic, it was cultural. And this has to be recognized because they changed the polity and economy, but the most important thing that they changed the way of thinking, the way of culture, how the cultural interaction took place. Slowly, of course, over a long period of time, over a century or 2 centuries, but still, culture was an element of modern colonialism. So before I come to how colonialism changed the history writing in India, I'll give you a kind of analogy from architecture. In the pre-modern period, in the pre-colonial period, we can say from earlier period, when new buildings were made after demolishing the old buildings, much of the material of the old buildings like bricks and other material were used intact in the similar form, even if it led to some kind of imperfection in the new building, but they were used because the means were limited. They could not always procure cement and they could not always procure bricks in that way. But now, when the old buildings are demolished, all these things are put in the stone crushers. Either they are turned into cement so that they can be reused, or they are just discarded and used somewhere else in the roads or in some other places. So the modern buildings emerge as a new building, completely architecturally and in terms of its material also. Colonialism did the same thing to Indian history writing. It completely changed the course of Indian history writing, unlike pre-colonial period. For example, when the Muslims came to India, there was a new form of historiography, new form of history writing. We called it Indo-Persian annals. They were written in Persian and they derived from Arabic and Persian historiography. But the Indian forms, the Puranic forms, were not discarded. They also continued to flourish until 18th and early 19th, even early 19th century, but definitely till 18th century. So both the Puranic chronology, Puranic historiography and Indo-Persian historiography existed side by side. But in the colonial period, when the new form of history developed, all the earlier forms were not only discarded, they were in a way eliminated. So nobody writes now the Puranic history. Nobody writes now the Indo-Persian kind of history. All the history which is written now follows in the wake of the modern European history. So how it was done, how this new building was built, that will be my purpose in this talk. How I'm going to explain a bit. So the two things which it did right from the beginning was to introduce a new theory of history and a new methodology. So the new theory of history, while in the pre-colonial period, the theory of history was both. It was linear sense of time and a cyclical sense of time. So Satyug is not only in the past, Satyug is in the future also, because one day it will come back. So Satyug belongs to both past and the future. The golden age exists on both sides. But in the linear history, either the golden age was in the past or it will be in the future. It will not be on both sides. So that is the linear form of history. So the linear form of history was introduced. Another thing was introduced, that this linearity, although this derived from Jewish Christian historiography, but it did not completely follow them, because Jewish Christian historiography conceived two things. One was the monogenesis, common origin of the world. That was their prerogative, which the modern historiography, which developed in Europe, discarded completely. Monogenesis was not the part of the plan. Secondly, over a period of time, for some time, decline in the linear history, there was the kind of idea of decline, and then there was a kind of idea of progress also. It both continued to exist for quite some time. But by the late 18th century, the decline was completely jettisoned in favor of progress. So now we have a linear history, which was never the case earlier, neither in Europe nor in India or anywhere in the world, that there is a continuous progress. So the idea of civilization, a kind of hierarchy which was built, as Salil has explicated, was based on this, that the earlier civilization, however high and mighty they might have been in their time, were now nothing in comparison with the modern European civilization, because there is a progressive linear history. So modern European civilization exists at the pinnacle of history, while the earlier civilization, they might have been good and high during their times, but now they are nothing but the childhood stage of the development of civilization. This was the kind of theory of history which was built during the late 18th and early 19th century in Europe, and it has been continuing like that. So the present period is the best, and the earlier period, as we go back, where the slowly we find that the lower stage of civilization is there. So that was the new theory of history which was imposed, and this completely differed from all the earlier forms of history in India as well as in the world. The second thing was the method. So new method was introduced, and I'll deal with the new method, how it was developed over a period of time, how they were introduced. And this new method, in nutshell, I'll tell you, this consisted in the decomposition of the earlier histories. Now these earlier histories, whether they were Puranas, epics, Indo-Persian chronicles, they were not now considered histories. They were considered as, at the most, they were considered as sources. So they are no longer an integral form of history with an ideology and a conceptualization. Rather, they are just forms of sources from which certain facts could be derived, so that the modern buildings, modern history, colonial history could be built. So the earlier forms of history had to be demolished. So these earlier forms of history, particularly Puranic and both Indo-Persian histories, they existed till the early part of 19th century, say first decade of 19th century. But after that, they were not heard of. They just disappeared. And probably in the history of any civilization, a history of any culture, this kind of disappearance is seldom to be found. But here, the Puranic forms of history, the cyclical notion of time, no longer exists. It's only a linear form of history. And this is what colonialism did to the writing of Indian history. So it was, whether it is good or bad is not my point at the moment, because I'm not going for value judgment. I'm going for the process. The processes which were set in motion during the colonial period, so far as history writing was concerned. The second thing which was done by the colonial historiographers, or colonial theorists of history, was to delegitimize the fabulous and mythical ideas involved in the earlier conceptualization of past. As you know, in all forms of history, particularly in India, myths and legends have been a part of the understanding of the past. Many of the past things were understood through myths and legends, fables, what they were called fables are. So fable came as a kind of pejorative term during colonial time, but they were kind of mythical understanding of past. So past was conceived in this form. So that form was delegitimized. And thirdly, the language used in the earlier discourses, which was poetic and ornate, were also delegitimized, leading to prosaic form of presentation, dry to dust kind of prosaic kind of presentation, so as to present as if the author does not exist, as if there is no viewpoint to the history. History exists on its own. So this whole idea of objectivity, by removing the author and by removing the viewpoint, supposedly, because the author and viewpoints are never removed, but supposedly, at least in the presentation, this was done. So we have a new theory of history. We have a delegitimization of earlier forms of time, cyclical and time. And thirdly, the language, the discarding of the poetic language in favor of a prosaic language. So now, how this thing was done, and this was a pretty ambitious project. Sometimes it was conscious, but sometimes it was not even conscious. It was quite unconscious in its presentation. So now, this was done by three kinds of people during colonial period. One were the Orientalists. As we know, they were the most important, like hello? Hello?
Yes, it's fine. It's fine. Keep speaking.
Right. So first were the Orientalists, starting with William Jones, but even before that, I'll come to that, because there were two kinds of Orientalism which was there. Then the other people were evangelicals. They also wrote some history, not very prominent, but they were there. And third were the Anglicists, like James Mill and others. But many of the historians, actual historians, belong to, they derive from all the three, particularly from the Orientalism and Anglicism. So Orientalism, in its basic ideas, it meant that Indian civilization in the past was good. It was high so far as its contemporary standards were concerned. And its culture and language was that they were praised. Anglicists condemned all that, which I think Salil has dealt with all that, like James Mill did. They condemned it and they said it was a rude form of civilization. It was at the lower level. And then evangelicals also condemned the earlier forms of both Hindu and Muslim civilization, what they called, because they thought in religious terms. So that was thing. So Orientalists, now in order to establish, in order to make this new building, which will be completely new in all its formations, the old building need to be demolished. In Indian case, they found it easy because the forms of writing, particularly the Puranic forms of historiography, was completely different from whatever existed in the West or in the Abrahamic kind of civilizations, either Jewish or Christian or Muslim. There we have some more or less a kind of linear form of history, though not progressive form of history because it's the other way around, but a linear form. Here we have a cyclical form. Cyclical form existed in ancient Greece, but when the Europeans appropriated Greek to their own culture, and here I must, as an aside, I have to tell you that Greek did not actually belong to the European civilization. It was appropriated later on as a European civilization. Greek was very much part of Asian and African civilization. It was located on the cusp of that thing, West Asia and Egypt, North Africa. So it was part of this civilizational and cultural milieu rather than the European. Europe did not even figure in Greek, ancient Greek writings. So that is as an aside, it's nothing to do with this now. So Greek forms and many other earlier history writings had this cyclical idea, but this was rejected now in the favor of linear idea. So in India, the colonial historiography, colonial historians set about proving the historicity of India. They wanted to prove, that is the demolition of the building, earlier building, that there was no history in India at all. So they said that all that was history was fables. There is nothing which existed as a kind of facts. There was no narrative, historical narrative, no linearity, no chronology, nothing. So historiography, they did not try to find what other forms of perception of the past could be there. They simply thought that since their understanding, the history according to their understanding did not exist in India, it was not history at all. So they found it pretty easy. And later even Indians, Western educated Indians found it easy to accept this idea that India had no history. So the earlier building was effectively demolished. So now they set about historicizing India. Since earlier India was ahistorical, there was no history, and there was no history for two reasons. History, as you know, had two meanings. One is writing on the past, and the second meaning is past itself. It's called that the country has no history. It means it has no past. And on the other hand, someone is not a historian. He does not write history. That means history means writing of history. So history has two meanings. So India was said to lack history in both its meanings. It has no writings of history, no historical writings, and also no past. Because the thing is, it was said that India could not write history because it did not make any history. So this was stated, this was a statement by Arthur MacDonald, who wrote History of Sanskrit Literature. It's a very famous history. So he said India did not write any history because they did not make any history. So it was effectively demolished. It was, at least in the discourses of the English-educated Indians, as well as in the discourses of the Europeans, it was supposed to have been decisively proved that India had no history, or it even had no past. So now they not only started constructing a history in the form of history writing on past, but also a form of history in the sense of past. So how to go about it? So now they looked for various sources. Indian literature, obviously, history could be denied, but Indian literature could not be denied. That existed in plenty. So they started looking for facts into those by breaking down the integral ideological conceptual structure of those texts. For example, what I'm trying to say, that each Purana has an integral structure, a whole conceptualization, a whole ideology behind it. All these related to a particular god who has particular qualities, and the Puranic narrative tries to explicate, tries to bring out, tries to unfold those qualities of a particular god. So there can be Shiv Purana, there can be Vishnu Purana, there can be Devi Purana, and so many kinds. So they have an integral structure. Now all their integral structure were demolished, and just they were started looking for facts. What does it say about a particular king? What does it say about a particular region, a particular language, a particular caste, so on and so forth. So these facts, discrete facts, were tried to be taken out from that, extracted from that, by completely demolishing the text. So this gave rise to a kind of line of study called philology, that is science of language. Philological, but even before philology, another form develops that was looking after the sources of revenues, that is land system. So land system was important to know, and also the governance. So governance, for governance, you need to know about the legal system, need to establish some legal system. So for both the land system and legal system, they had to rely on some kind of Indian interlocution, some kind of Indian intermediaries. And this they found among the Maulvis, among the Muslims, and Pandits among the Hindus. So they legitimized their authenticity. Well, in pre-colonial period, the sources of authenticity were many. These sources of authenticity could be king, it could be Brahmins, it could be local potentates, it could be chiefs of a village, many people. The sources of power were not concentrated. Sources of power were diffused among many people. So it has been written by Nicholas Dirks and many other people that in the pre-colonial period, it was the king who decided about caste. Brahmins could be referred to. They used to find out legitimation for everything which the king wanted. But it is the king who decided who is going in the hierarchy, who is to be placed where in the hierarchy. But that I'm not going into that discussion. What I'm saying that this whole idea of pre-colonial sources of authority was discarded in favor of a unitary source of authority that was to be placed among the priests of both religion. So even the Islam, customary religion, Sufism, was discarded in favor of high religion, particular interpretations of Quran and Hadith and other things, and whatever prophet was reported to have said by the earlier Isnad traditions. Among the Hindus, it was the Brahmins who were contacted, and they came out with this whole kind of Sanskritic learnings and Smritis and Dharma Shastras, and that were made part of the legal system. So the legal system now not only legitimized the authority of the Pandits and Maulvis, but also legitimated the authority of particular Dharma Shastras. And even among the Dharma Shastras, Manu Dharma Shastras were considered the highest, rather than going about many other Dharma Shastras which have a variety of opinions. So a particular kind of legal system was built. Now, over a period of time, we find that these things got completely incorporated in the colonial power structure, in which this hierarchy, which existed in a diffused form, this authenticity, authority, sources of authority, which were diffused, now became concentrated in particular persons. The kings no longer existed, the pre-colonial kings, so their authority was completely demolished. So authorities of the Brahman among particular religions were replaced, and ultimate authority, of course, belonged to the colonial authorities. So that was done. Secondly, after this, when they come to philology, what they tried to establish was the supremacy of Sanskrit as the quintessential Indian language, or the language of the past. Now, we all know Sanskrit was not so widely spoken. It might have been the language of the elite. It might have been the language of the certain class of Brahmins, not all Brahmins, of course, but certain class of Brahmins. And it might have been incorporated in certain texts. But at the same time, there were a variety of other forms. There were Pali texts, there were Prakrit texts, there were Persian texts, and many other forms which existed. And outside these texts, outside this literary culture, there existed a lot of customary things. All these things, all these customs and all the other language traditions were demolished by this whole Orientalist thrust of putting faith only in the Sanskrit language. So a kind of Sanskritic culture was sought to be built. And since Sanskrit language was almost completely monopolized by the Brahmins, so the authority of the Brahmins got further reinforced. So whatever the pre-colonial Brahmins probably didn't have lesser authority than what, because their authority was concentrated in particular kings. If the kings accepted their versions, they were powerful. But if the kings did not accept their versions, which they did not for, say, 500 or 700 years of Muslim rule, so they were not so powerful. I mean, they might have been, so they kept writing books, but they were not powerful in the power, in the authority structure, because no Muslim king was going to accept the authority of the Brahmin for the whole of the country. Maybe sometimes they accepted the authority of the Brahmins for regulation of certain legalities, but not as a whole. But during the colonial times, the Brahmins' authority became very much reinforced. So they became much more powerful than they ever were in the pre-colonial period. So that was, so I'm coming to history now. So that was, philology was another thing. The third thing was a kind of whole institutional network they built. So Asiatic Society was built, then the Bombay Literary Society was built, Literary Society of Madras was established. So all these societies were built through which all these researches would take place. But all these societies were controlled completely by the Europeans. Until 1829, no Indian could be a member of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So they could not even be the member. And not till the 1940s, they could be in the decisive position to decide the policies. So Indians were completely excluded from all these societies. So this whole network of societies, whole network of institutional structures were built. Third thing was archaeology, the establishment of archaeology. So 1861, archaeology was, the whole discipline of archaeology was formed, and the Archaeological Society was established, and it started looking, bringing out new, exploring in the new things. And it's massive, and the best achievement came up in 1920 when Indus Valley civilization was discovered. So now after that, we find that there was, from all these things, and also I'll refer to certain things. For example, some of things were very important. Important in the sense of creation of modern kind of history, the history we know about. Earlier, the chronology was a problem. So far as the early period of Indian history was concerned, people did not know when which king came up. They were all there in Puranas, but the Puranas do not give the exact dates. Now, dates were very difficult to find. So this date was first established by William Jones, when he discovered that the Greek Sandrakotas was actually Chandragupta and Pali Bothra was Patliputra. So in 1793, he found this. And then after that, he found references of Chandragupta in many of the Puranic texts and many of the places. So there was a chronological base, a chronological referent was found there. And after that, it was easier to do that. Many things came up, and the numismatics was developed. So in the coins, you find many other kings like Saka kings, like Kanishka, then also about Gupta kings, Samudragupta. Then Allahabad inscription was read. So we have this whole field of epigraphy developing. So philology, archaeology, epigraphy, legal studies, numismatics, all these methodologies were developed to give a kind of structure for the development of Indian historiography of the modern kinds. Paleography. that is the reading of the ancient languages, ancient texts. The first important breakthrough came in 1837 when James Prinsep read the Ashokan Brahmi. And from there, the entire course of Indian history writing changed, because Ashoka's inscriptions were there all over India, as far as Afghanistan, and it portrayed some kind of what was thought as factual history. Some facts were given. So it gave a whole kind of bone structure for the establishment of chronology on Indian history. So after 1837, after the deciphering of Ashokan Brahmi by James Prinsep, it became very important that Indian history could be easily formulated, easily chronicalized. It can be done that way. So we find that in 60 years, from say 1793 to the middle of 19th century, most of the chronological foundation of Indian historiography, Indian history writing in the modern period, was laid down. So in about 60 years, the British were able to create a new historiography for India, which in their region, in Europe, it took 4 centuries. So here it was rushed. It was rushed very hard. So in 60 years, they created what it had taken 400 years in Europe to establish the modern historiography, because there the knowledge was slowly evolving. Here the knowledge was there, so they just had to impose it. There, the kings and the authority structure was not very favorable for new modern types of knowledge. Here the authority structure, the colonialism, was favorable because it wanted to appropriate India politically, economically, and culturally to its colonial project. So colonial historiography, the whole form of history writing, became a part of the colonial project. Now coming to Orientalists, please remind me of the time so that it's a long topic, so I have to be stopped at some point. So William Jones, for example, are Orientalists.
You will take another 5 minutes, sir?
Okay, I'll finish in 5 minutes. Okay, then I'll skip this Orientalism. I'll talk about some of the themes which were developed. And here, before coming to the themes, I have to point out, because they conceived India in the form of certain naturalized categories, some universal categories, which were kind of frozen, like caste, like village, like racial theories. So in that sense, actual empirical history was denied. So their project of history writing, empirical history writing, was negated by their project of putting India in homogeneous categories. So this is just a beginning statement. I'll elucidate what I mean by that. First, coming to village society. This became a part of accepted common sense that India was a village society. And this village was a self-sufficient unit which had no history. It continued throughout the, so empires might come, empires might go, but village remained the same. And throughout the 19th century, even in the 20th century, when the nationalists appropriated it, village became a kind of essential unit of India, Indian civilization. Now, the problem is, what are the facts? I mean, from what are the sources to prove it? This started with Thomas Munro in his report on Anantapur. Anantapur is a district in Andhra Pradesh, from where Krishna Devaraya is supposed to have come. So it's in, Thomas Munro was doing some land survey there, and he wrote a report from Anantapur. So that in that report, he put this idea in 1806 that India is a land of villages, and village is a self-sufficient unit. Village is a small republic, and he had no history. He had no knowledge of history. He had no knowledge of Indian sources. He had no knowledge of Indian villages. Just on the basis of a report for land survey, he was doing land survey for taxation. On that basis, he built a meta theory, which continued for more than a century and is still continuing probably, that India was a land of villages, which are small republics, which have no history, which were self-sufficient, and so on and so forth. So this was a form of historiography they were introducing. Another was, India was a caste society. That developed a little later in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. Then India was identified completely as units of caste. So village, now there's a contradiction, logical problem. If India was a land of villages, if village is a constituent unit of Indian civilization, how can caste be the constituent unit? Because caste cuts across village. So if caste is the constituent unit, then village cannot be the constituent unit. As simple as that. Now, again, for caste also, we have slender evidences, but I'm not going into detail because, as I mentioned earlier, caste in the pre-colonial period was a diffuse category. It was not a fixed category, it was a diffuse category. So, and caste in terms of European sense, in any case, I don't want to go into this because it's a different kind of argumentation altogether. Now, the third thing which I want to mention here is the whole racial theory of Indian civilization. This again became very important. The whole kind of Aryanism which developed. It started with William Jones' idea for Indo-European people on the basis of the affinity of languages, various languages, Sanskrit, then Greek, Latin, Celtic languages, Slavic languages, all the affinity of these languages. He established very scientifically, very correctly, that there was a kind of common language earlier from which all these languages arose. This was a scientific finding, and it was used later on in development of whole linguistics, and it is very important. But another thing which Jones did, and that was also part of his project, a kind of ethnology, in the sense that he related this philological finding, this linguistic finding, to race, to ethnology. So he said that all these people, Indo-European people, were probably a race, a common stock. He did not use the word race, he said common stock. They belong to a common stock. Now, this is a problem, but I'll come to that. After him, in the early 19th century, we have this concrete racial structure developing in which Indo-Europeans developed as a kind of race. So one anthropologist, Pritchard, he said in 1820s and 1830s about a distinct Indo-European race. After that, it became a common part of the common parlance of, and particularly after Max Muller in 1847 and early 1850s, tried to establish that language and race were correlated. Later, he abandoned this idea, but the damage was done. Language and biological race were conflated. They had become one, and they had given rise to his whole idea of Aryan race. Now, contrary to this, again, but similar in structure, for the South India, this whole Dravidian group of languages were discovered by Francis Ellis earlier, but later on by in a more organized form by Cardwell, which again conflated the language with the race. Now, this is a whole lot of problem because language is not race. Speaking a similar language does not mean that people belong to the same race. And here the term which Max Muller used for distinguishing the high caste and low caste and Aryans and the indigenous people, on the basis of only three passages from Rig Veda. One passage talks about the term Anas. Now the term Anas, Max Muller interpreted as a nas, without nose. And he meant by saying that the Aryans were sharp-nosed while the indigenous people were snub-nosed. Now, Max Muller knew that Sayanachar, the 14th century Indian interpreter of Rig Veda, he was in the early Vijayanagar period, his view was completely different because, in fact, in his translation of Rig Veda, Max Muller had attached Sayanachar interpretation also. According to Sayanachar, Anas did not mean a plus nas. The sandhi did not go like that. It's not without nose. It without unas, without speech. So what he wanted to say that when the Aryans, we call it early Vedic people because the term is no longer scientifically used, because the early Vedic people, when they said the indigenous people as unas, without speech, that means that they were not speaking Sanskrit, as simple as that. They did not belong to their culture. So they were different, like Mlecha. They did not say that they were without nose. That is just one passage. So, and even if it meant without nose, one passage in whole of Rig Vedic corpus cannot be used to build a whole theory of racialism, racial Aryanism. Second thing which was found was Krishna Twach in two passages. Now again, Sayanachar interprets Krishna Twach, Krishna as a proper name, that there was a Krishna whom the early Vedic people faced, and they summoned, faced in battle, and Krishna was a very powerful indigenous king, so early Vedic people faced him in battle, so they summoned Indra, who removed his skin. So Krishna Twach. So it was a removal of the skin, which Sayanachar interpreted, while Max Muller, again, knowing it fully well that Sayanachar interprets it differently, he interpreted it as black skin. Now, even if Anas and Krishna Twach meant what Max Muller said, even if they meant, just the three instances proved completely that the Vedic people were not interested either in color or in noses. They were more interested in culture, of which there are enormous number of references when they were talking about the people who were barbarians because they did not know Sanskrit and they did not follow Vedic rituals. So despite this thing, because they wanted to impose the racial conceptualization which was developing in Europe on Indian society. So this is how the European historiography was imposed on India during the colonial time, and the Indian conceptualization of their own culture and people and languages and history and past was sidelined, marginalized, and after a point eliminated. This is where I'll rest now. Whatever will come, I'll answer during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Upadhyay. It's quite an elaborate elucidation of how various people in the colonial period interpreted their history based on their sources and their interests, starting from William Jones and the later historians. So it's thanks a lot on behalf of Anek Dhara once again. Now we'll go on to a question set, and there are quite a few questions which are posed at different points. So I'll try and categorize and summarize them and then pose the questions to each of you. The first question is, while writing history involves a reciprocal process between interpretation and selection of facts and between facts and values, acceptance of a civilization's history by its own people may be an important issue. What are the challenges posed by distortions and of popular perception engendered in the process of creating a dominant culture?
Now, you see what was happening, the story that I gave, and the essence of the story was that since the 19th century, a large number of scholars, initially British, but later also Indians, they were trying to look at pre-modern history of India, India's past. Now, in looking at India's past, they were looking at it primarily in civilizational terms, because this very important idea of civilization had come up. Now, what should be the constitutive elements into this civilization? That was the big question. And I think religion was, of course, one of them, but there can be alternative or different ways of looking at the elements which go into the making of the civilization. But religion, of course, was one of them. And when people, when we look at the history of pre-modern times and social history, then religion obviously is a very, very important idea. But what I try to narrate is that different people, large number of people, they were giving new inputs. They were looking at this idea of civilization in very, very different ways, but these ways were not always contradictory. So from Bankim onwards, from Bankim to Bhandarkar, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, and very many more people, they provided their own inputs, as a result of which we had a very vibrant notion of definition of civilization, but also a very plural definition of civilization. But it's also being reinvented, redefined in a whole range of different ways. So it is a contested issue, and these kinds of contests have to go on, because what we are dealing with is an extremely complex, but also a very important concept of civilization. So we have to agree that there cannot be just be one way of looking at the civilization.
Would you like to add anything, Professor Upadhyay?
Yeah. See, when you talked about E.H. Carr and from where this comes as a reciprocal process, of course, it is between historian. Carr is speaking mostly in terms of individual history writing. When we come to the process of a kind of civilizational process, a kind of whole structures, changing the course of history by cultural manipulation, by cultural intervention, the kind of, Carr also deals with that facts are not exactly facts all the time. But so the problem of facts itself becomes a problem, because it's not only interpretation. Interpretation, of course, is there. But facts cannot be removed from the idea of interpretation. Facts are gathered. That's how in the colonial times, all these forms which were developed, archaeology, philology, etc., and by breaking the Indian texts, so all these facts were started to be gathered into what we call colonial archives. These colonial archives did not mean that they were housed only in the buildings. That, of course, they were housed in the buildings, but otherwise also in many journals, many other ideas, many speeches, they were housed all over in the traveler's report and many things. So the fact itself, how the facts are created, and Carr deals with that, the facts, creation of the fact is not an innocent process. If you can say this is the fact which exists, it will be, for example, you can easily say that, okay, there's fact of Hindus and facts of Muslim existing as religious groups. Now, it's not so simple. Religions in textual forms can exist like that, but even in case of Hinduism, even that does not exist like that. Even in case of Islam, there have been many interpretations. But so far as the adherents of the religions are concerned, there is no homogeneity. So a kind of facts which we are looking for, a kind of homogeneous categorization, does not exist. So again, the value judgment comes at various levels. And value judgments, when Gandhi talked about caste, when he talked about untouchability, he said, I'm not bothered about the scriptures, what the scriptures are saying. I'm bothered about morality. I'm bothered about humanity. Whether it conforms to morality and humanity, that you do not treat a person as human being. And if it does not, then I'm not bothered about text. Text can remain or they can go. They have to be changed. So that is the fact. Fact is where the value judgment is done. Now, that is again a slippery field, because history writing is never easy. That again is slippery field. We do not know. Morality can vary according to group understanding, according to an individual understanding. But again, that will be going into. But the basic thing to understand is that facts do not exist as such unless they are attested by a group of historians at a particular time, group of scholars at a particular time, a kind of scientific understanding that this is a fact. And then after that, we can take it as a fact. And they might also change, like it happens in sciences after a particular time. It can be changed, but again, after some kind of consensual understanding. So that is my thing. You may.
Thank you very much, sir. And the next one is any concept like feudalism, colonialism, secularism, etc., is not absolute but relative, like European feudalism, Indian feudalism, etc. Similarly, should not the historians explore the Indian variety of colonialism, which probably the writer is meaning the exploitation perpetrated by Indians on Indians, precisely by Hindus on Hindus about 3 millennia. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Concepts are not precisely, they are not absolute, they are relative. Feudalism, of course, has been debated a long time, whether it applies only to Europe or to whole of the world. And historians have raised this conclusion that right since Mukhya wrote was there feudalism in Indian history, that feudalism is not a universal concept. It's not a universal situation. Colonialism, as I tried to argue earlier, that colonialism have been different in earlier times. And now the modern colonialism is completely different in the sense that it involves a lot of cultural transformation also, which the earlier colonialism did not do so much. In fact, sometimes the reverse also happened. When the Romans conquered Greece, it was the Greek civilization which they adopted. So while the civilization, cultural colonization worked the other way, the physical colonization was from Rome to Greece, but the cultural colonization was from Greek to Rome. And that develops a different form of situation called Greco-Roman. But that is it. So they are also relative, they are different. Of course, I agree with that. Now coming to the idea whether colonization can be used on the same people. Yes, the term has been used like internal colonization in terms of territory, because colonization as a term meant in territorial, it was a territorial term. To begin with, colonization was territorial term. So it has been argued earlier that how a center is colonizing particular territories, people are being sent there, and their culture and things are compromised and all that. So colonization worked that way. Now, whether colonization can be used in terms of, say, the whole caste divide of the discrimination and marginalization of the untouchables over a period of time, that I'm doubtful, because see, the terms, if they are universalized too much, they lose their meaning. If you use the same term for every kind of process, then there's no need for any term. You can just use one term. So distinctiveness of a particular process is negated by use of a same term in various contexts. So in order to preserve the distinctive, because all these things are categories, these are human constructs, the term colonialism, they were done to denote something, and they have evolved also over a period of time. They can be changed, of course, they can be changed. But if they are changed to mean caste situation in India, so then they probably cannot be applied to some other situations. So they'll change their meaning. example, many terms change their meaning. For example, grammar, which village society, when I said grammar didn't mean village in a territorial sense. It meant a group of kulas, a kind of clan. So earlier, which could be moving also, I mean, which need not be settled. So, but gram has changed its meaning. It has now become a village, a settled village, a territory. That way, meaning can be changed, but then it will not mean the other thing, because both things are different. What the Europeans did in India, what the Romans did in Greece and other places, what the many others, this kind of situation in which territorial aggrandizement was did, that cannot be probably used for, if it meant that, it cannot be used for caste, except in a specific sense, if we can factually establish that, and again, that will be going into racial kind of interpretation, that some people came from outside and they established their rule here and changed everything, and they appropriated other things. Like it has been said about the Aryans moving into India and then establishing their rule there. For example, Muslims moving into India, and because then we can also have to talk about Muslim colonialism, and then, but in their wisdom over the years, scholars have decided that colonialism is the term which is used for a people who are not only different at the point of contact, but they remain different throughout in various ways. So extraction of resources are constantly taking place to some other countries. So that is there where colonialism comes in. So Muslims, particularly after the initial encounter, they settled here. They became as much Indian as anybody else. They developed the same ethos. So it was not a colonialism in that sense. It was invasion at a particular point of time, but it was not colonialism. So I think colonialism cannot be indiscriminately used, in my opinion, but of course, things are open to change. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the next question is, even the most tolerant and liberal Indians like Vivekananda, Gandhiji, etc. invoke religion repeatedly. Is it one of the primary reasons for the present violent religious revivalism? I think.
Salil?
Yeah, I'll answer it. You see, it is always a very tempting idea to blame. We have an unsatisfactory present. We have many problems in the present. And it's for scholars, it's always a very tempting idea to blame the past for all the presence, for all the problems of the present, and one can establish connections. But I don't think that's really a very, very good idea. Point is, why were our best minds, our cultural, political, intellectual leaders using the category of religion? Well, I think with full justification. Gandhi was using that. In fact, Gandhi's genius lay in the fact that he was able to use the category of religion in very inclusive ways, not by separating, not by trying to separate one from the other, but by trying to create linkages, trying to create unities. It was a very creative process. That was a kind of an experiment which Gandhi was doing, which our national movement was doing. And we can see why it was so very important for a plural society like India. Now, obviously, what happened in the past could not be a total guarantee of a happy future, because times are connected, but they're also unconnected. What happens in the present is a result of so many other developments, political, socio-economic developments, and so on. So I think we must understand our past, but it's not a very good idea to mechanically blame things that were done in the past for the problems of the present. So I really would not really, as a scholar, I do not really see the connection between the use of religion by our leaders in the 19th and earlier 20th century and the kind of politics of religious intolerance that we have in our midst. I don't see that connection.
Thank you, Professor Misra. The next question is, Hindus feel that 2% of Hindus monopolizing 98% priesthood, and the worst customs like Pankti Bheda and Madisnane, etc. as normal. should social historians bear blame for not properly exposing such inhumanities? So the blame is on your court, in your courts.
I think that's for Shashi Bhushan to answer. My previous question in some ways answers this also, but I think Shashi will probably have more to say on this.
I don't know whether historians can do much about this, except for bringing out the thing that, see, historians' job are twofold, of course. Historians operate with a certain conceptualization and certain value judgment, true. But they also want to have a kind of territory in which they can walk through at least some way without passing value judgments. So that is important. Unless they have that, it will be very difficult for any scholarship to flourish, because then it will all be contending value judgments and tutu mame kind of things. So historians try to avoid that. Now, of course, any minority of population appropriating certain cultural, religious, and social privileges for themselves at the expense of the large number of people is bad. Not only bad, in this case, it's very bad, horrendous, in the sense that why should they? And again, with this, it is becoming a problem. The whole movements which arose throughout the period, since the early medieval period, what we call Bhakti movement, they challenged this idea. They challenged this idea of Brahminical supremacy, their priesthood, and they created alternative structure for establishing their own thing. They might have later degenerated, whatever, I mean, in the sense developed into another forms of caste. But this is clear that their whole project about delegitimizing the hereditary priesthood was, of course, successful in a certain sense, that many people in customary ways do not go, except for certain life cycle rituals. They do not need priests for all the time. So, of course, that there. So what we need to do, of course, is in a democratic society, we have to legally debar this kind of thing, that priesthood can belong to anybody who is capable of doing that. There's, of course, and this has been going on since the national movement period, and many people, many social reformers have preached this, including starting with Dayanand and Brahmo Samaj also, and many Brahmo Samaj had their own marriages, separate marriages. Dayanand also preached that. Gandhi, in a way, accepted that, but he did not much prioritize this because he had many other projects. But this, of course, is there. Secondly, to develop alternative structures in which the need for this kind of hereditary priesthood might be minimized, if not eliminated altogether. This is all I can say. Otherwise, I think it's a social political questions and not exactly for the historians to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There are quite a few questions still to be addressed, and we are almost come to 2 hours session. So I will briefly touch some of them, and then so there's a question on different traditions of historiography by colonialists, Marxists, subalterns, and nationalists. And the question is in the context of how do right-wing colonial history rewriting projects that are taking place get placed in this various traditions, or is it a new tradition?
See, I describe colonial historiography in a certain way. That is, colonial historiography was a project of establishing cultural hegemony of colonialism on Indian population, and they quite succeeded. But at another level, they succeeded in another form also. that they made this kind of history writing and many of these conceptualizations near permanent for us to follow, because the kind of archives they created, colonial archives, which we call it, they have that kind of factual material. So whenever we refer to the colonial sources, we find these kind of categorization like Hindu, Muslims, caste-related categorization, and many other things, such things. So now I have faced this problem with my own researches and also with the researches which I have guided, that, for example, the use of the term native. In a very enlightened thesis, lady researcher, she just went on using the term native for the Indians in all the contexts. Now I had to tell her that this is the language of the sources, you need not reproduce it, because native is a pejorative category, and it was definitely a pejorative category in colonial. But because the language of the sources say that, so many students just use the language of the sources for their own. So that is a problem with colonial archives, that it has created the base for the use of the language, use of the category in certain ways, from which even the nationalists and even some of the Marxist historians were not immune. They use those language. Self-consciously, I have found only the subaltern historians who have self-consciously tried to do away with this kind of language and tried to develop their own alternative structures. But because it was very difficult to do that, they had to leave it midway and move into another direction. Because once this archive is created, this colonial archive is created, unless a new form of archive is created, it will be very difficult to overcome that, because our sources. Now, coming to the present situation, the whole colonial conceptualization of religion did create this divide, religious divide. For example, let me tell you about religion. The British censuses did not have religious categories. There was no religious categories in the British census because of this whole split between Protestants and the Catholics. But in India, the first thing they introduced was the religious category, Hindu and Muslim, and they started counting. So all the other forms, all the diffuse forms, which were there, like Kabir Panthis, like Nanak Panthis, many others, they were forced to divide either between Hindu or between Muslims. Or they can say they were atheists, which very few would like to say, because they were not atheists. So we find certain situations, there might be more work on this. There was this situation in which, like Kabir Panthis used to follow both traditions and many of their own invented traditions. But when this census was there, they were forced to divide themselves into Hindus and Muslims, and whole Kabir Panth vanished after that. Because if they were Hindus and Muslims, so obviously the whole purpose of Kabir Panth was defeated. But the census forced them, if they were to be counted for anything, they had to do that. Now, these forms of colonial manipulation actually gave rise to all these categories, which have been very difficult to. So even if now we are using that category without understanding it, so it means we are uncritically appropriating the colonial categories which were established for a particular purpose, either consciously or unconsciously, for dividing the population, because they were pretty clear that religion was a divisive factor. That's why they did not use it in English censuses, but they used it in the Indian censuses. And same thing is with caste. So what I want to say, that if anybody is appropriating those categories and trying to build a whole structure out of that, they may be thinking of doing something very new, but it is actually following the basic colonial categorization instead of looking for various diffuse sources of Indian intellectual and cultural manifestations. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Right, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Brahmins becoming extremely powerful during the British is because of British misunderstanding, or is it a good pro-quo arrangement where the British Brahmin axis tried to rob the majority Indians?
Brahmins became very powerful. Now, see, we try to see instrumentalism, a kind of conspiracy in many of the historical processes, which might not be there. Even British colonial historiography was not created as a part of conspiracy, but as a cultural project. It's not because they wanted to demean the Indians. It's not because they always wanted to exploit them. That might have been one motive, but it was not so instrumentalist. Many people were there, like for example, Max Muller, many Germans, they were not part of this colonial project, but still they thought like that. So people think because a particular thinking is hegemonic at that particular point of time. It's not because they are part of a conspiracy. So the British had to refer to somebody when they were going for devising their legal system. Who would they refer to? Now in their wisdom, and that has been there since not only British, but even the Muslims face this problem. Who are they going to refer to if they are going to establish their land system and their legal system? And they again fail upon the Brahmins because Brahmins were literate and they held the place of honor, at least as an idea, not individual Brahmins maybe, but as an idea in the Indian population, among the Hindus at least. So Brahmanism was a powerful idea. Brahman was a powerful idea. So that's why, see, that is another topic, but see, in all the Dalit mythical origins, this origins of what we call myths of origins, we have Dalits descending from the Brahmins. As a Brahmin people, there were two brothers. One was a Brahmin, there were two brothers who fell apart. One remained Brahmin and another became Dalit because the person who became Dalit was eating meat or eating beef or for whatever reason. Probably could not defend a cow, for all these. So there are many myths of origins because Brahmin was a powerful idea. This thing was there. So this idea was taken up by the Muslim rulers later on, but at that time, because there were also Hindu kings who were very powerful and who were invariably not Brahmins. So there was another point of view also which came into being with the Muslim rulers. So they were not entirely relying on Brahmins for it, administration of Hindu legality. And secondly, they had their own legal framework also, which they applied, and administrative framework. With the British, the pre-colonial kings were either completely demolished or completely subdued, particularly in the late 19th century. And even since earlier, they had started building this whole structure, so they fell back. And because they also thought that Sanskrit is the most important language with which they felt an affinity because of this whole idea of Aryanism, this whole idea of Indo-Europeanism, which was a racial idea, but they brought it on the language. So by privileging Sanskrit, they had to privilege Brahmins, and by privileging Brahmins, they did rely on those who were scholarly Brahmins for the interpretation of text. And those Brahmins obviously put forward the ideas which benefited them and which was part of the text. So William Jones, for his legal administration, the book he translated for British legal administration was the Codes of Manu, Manu Smriti, that was translated as a. So it was not always a kind of conspiracy, but it was a kind of hegemonic idea, which they took and they spread it, and it became further hegemonic later on. It was challenged also, but it remained hegemonic for a long time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Actually, there is a question which has come up from the audience, which is a continuation of the earlier question on historiography. Did the historiography of India change in any significant way after independence, or does it continue the tradition established by the British? This was discussed again earlier, but if you can quickly summarize.
No, it is changed. It is changed a lot. It started changing with the nationalist historians who challenged many of these formulations, and they tried to develop their own structure. They did not fully succeed. The nationalist historians did not fully succeed. Then the Marxist historians, of course, they tried to introduce it. They tried to take a completely different route. They left the cultural cultural and social history. Social history they took sometimes, but cultural history they mostly ignored, except in few rare instances. They went for economic history. So most of the, because they knew that doing cultural history will be problematic, because again they have to rely on colonial categories, because if they wanted facts, if they did not want facts, obviously you don't have to rely on anything. But for facts, for writing of history, you need facts, you need evidences, you have to footnote. So they left that. So what Kushambi established, that he said that history of civilization is not the history of dynasties, and it's not even history of successive dynasties, it's a history of social formations. So he moved it completely into the direction of economic history, which the others also took up, and they went into the direction of economic history. And even when they were discussing political and cultural history or social history, they considered economy as the prime motive. So they tried to undo the British historiography, the colonial historiography, and its divisive impact by taking into a different direction, because economy affects uniformly everybody. So that uniformity they were trying to seek, and they tried to divide into classes. So by dividing into classes and by seeking economic route of historical explanation, they tried to overcome the social division and go into different kind of things. So they did try to change. It did change, and did change drastically. Some of the categories remain, however.
Thank you very much, sir. Next question is, E.H. Carr had viewed that history, above all else, is progress. Does this conceptualization of history get validated by the trends in the writing of Indian history?
Not necessarily. E.H. Carr might have thought that, because he was also somewhat influenced by that Enlightenment idea of linear development, linear progression. So he thought that, but Indian historiography, which developed particularly by the nationalist historiography did not accept this idea of progress. In fact, they rooted for the idea of decline. So they considered decline at various levels, particularly during the colonial period. They went for this idea of decline, that during colonial period we declined, while in the earlier period we were economically prosperous up to 18th century. And they might have been right in that, because again, R.C. Dutt and many other economic historians of that period, nationalist historians, they conclusively proved that India was much better off during the Mughal period than it was during the colonial period. So, of course, E.H. Carr's idea was not applicable in the history writing. This idea particularly, but he has many other good ideas, different ideas. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Language, race, conflation, and language, varna, conflation are similar in some way. Is it correct?
Yes. That is what the whole idea of Aryanism was about. It was about conflation of language and race, and in India, it was about the conflation of language and varna. So the Aryans were high caste people, high varna people, Dvijas. And the Shudras were the indigenous people, they were not non-Aryans. So this was a clear division which was made not only by Max Muller in the earlier period, but by many Indian commentators and by Risley. Risley was a very important figure in this whole idea of racial interpretation of caste, in which he completely divided, and he also introduced this another pseudo-scientific idea of phrenology, mapping of nose and face and head. It was called phrenology. It has been now proved that it is completely pseudo-scientific. It had no scientific basis. But he introduced this idea, and during the 19th century, it was very popular, even in the early 20th century, when Thurston applied it for South India, and Risley had applied it for North India. So this idea was very much there. This conflation was very much there. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We're coming to the last question, a long one. How is the history of ancient India, as constructed from ancient Indian religious texts by some historians, seen by the modern Indian historians, and the apparent contradictions are posited by this new narrative of the recent set of historians, who create history from the narrative of these ancient Indian sources such as Vedas and other religious texts? So, 2-3 questions combined into a long question.
Yeah. I'm not fully following it, but let me make some idea about it. The first part is not making much sense, but we think of these religious corpus as homogeneous. But if we take this idea, and which was very much in Indian tradition, there's any corpus is not, religious corpus is not homogeneous, not only in India, in many other places also, no religious corpus is homogeneous. But the interpretation is always put on that. So when Dayanand Saraswati interpreted Rig Veda, he tried to give a particular interpretation to that. But when Mahatma Phule tried to interpret the Vedic corpus, he gave a different kind of interpretation to that. Both probably failed to realize that this Vedic corpus, when we say Vedas, so we say for three things. The Samhitas, then Brahmanas, and then the Upanishads. The Samhitas are 4 Samhitas. These Rik Samhita, Yajur, Sam, Atharva, these are 4 Samhitas. So they are called Samhita. And all Upanishads are rightly called Vedanta. They were end of the Vedas, but they were part of the Vedic corpus. So this Vedic corpus developed over a period of, say, about 2,000 or 3,000 years. Now, at least 2,000 years. So now in 2,000 years, is it possible that there can be a kind of unity? So it's very, for example, most of the scholars agree that in Rig Veda, this Purush Sukta, from where the whole idea of Varna starts, was an interpolation. It was not part of Rig Veda. And this has been commented by the scholars, and now is mostly accepted that it's not part of the Rig Veda. So interpolations have been there. People have been putting. Same thing happened with Mahabharata. The original Jaya, which was written, was much shorter. But then people started adding, and this addition came up to even up to Muslim period. So these corpus are not uniform. They are not homogeneous. They are open to interpretations. And unless we accept it, we are going to fall for a particular kind of sectarian interpretation of particular things. Without that the historians cannot do. I mean, historians have to see the things in their right perspective. If I have answered the question, it's fine. Otherwise, probably we can restate the person can restate the question. Okay.
I think for the time being, we'll close it, sir. I think you have answered well, I think, addressed, because we are also running out of time.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now it's time to wind up the webinar. and my turn to propose vote of thanks. So I thank both Professor Salil Misra and Professor S B Upadhyay for their excellent and eloquent exposition on the writing of history in different contexts. They have brought out how various thoughts have entered into the writing of history, Indian history, and how it has influenced their contemporary periods and how they're influencing the current thinking also. So thank you very much, sir, for your
Thank you. Thank you.
acceptance immediately and for the wonderful talk. I also thank the audience for their patient listening. It's almost, though we said 90 minutes, it has almost gone up to 1 hour 30 minutes. 140 minutes, and you're all sitting very patiently. I also thank Sri Sadiq for the technical support, and of course, all my team members. And to conclude, our next webinar is again on the last Sunday of April, that is the 24th April, and the topic of discussion would be education. It would be addressed by Professor Krishna Kumar and Professor Anita Rampal, who have worked extensively on the field of education and in their different facets. So with this, I conclude this webinar, and thanks to everyone for making it successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.